Ooh, morning. Uh, it's so hard to wake up when it's dark out in the morning and evening, and there's like 2 hours of brightness in the middle of the day. So whenever you wake up, you're like, is it morning, evening, midnight? And then you see, like, oh, it is bright outside. Must be 12 o'clock. Then the sun sets at around 3, and then it's pitch dark again. Fuck, that's rude. So I'm gonna take a look at the news. Naturally, the most trending news item is the US NATO Russia Ukraine thing. It's naturally the thing that is most on the news at the moment. And I think I'm going to focus on that artifact of news. There is, however, another piece that has been mostly side looked, and it is that the US Senate has revisited the topic of the UFOs, which they call UAPs, but I'm going to call them UFOs because this modern era has a weird fancying of renaming people to birthing persons and whatever. Yeah, it's not swordsman, it's sword birthing person. Yeah. So they revisited the topic of the UFOs and they asked the committee or whatever it is that's doing this UFO news thing, if they've ever managed to capture one of those UFOs, if they have plans to capture those UFOs, and asking them to make plans to capture one of those UFOs. So it's looking like they are really going down the Independence Day timeline. It's interesting that the US Senate or whatever wanted the information and perhaps even an attempt be made to capture one of those UFOs. So it seems like we have corona, environmental collapse, the emberings of Third World War, and we're gonna start a war with the UFOs. But if you want to talk to somebody who has experience fighting these things, I wouldn't recommend it. I really wouldn't recommend it. It's not a good time. You might want to research them, maybe see if you can get any more actual data, see if you can do radio communication with them, but taking their drones down has a high probability of us being turned into the Sentinel Island, which is not a good outcome. I'm watching these, cramp in my leg. I'm watching these Ukrainian, US, whatever news articles and seeing what is up. And I took out 6 bags of trash yesterday. That was pretty freaking amazing. They dare not say president. This is just so.
Shell – крупнейшая в Европе нефтяная компания. 80%
No
добываемых
sehän helpotti paljon.
А вы требуете от каких-то гарантий. Вы должны нам дать гарантии. Вы и немедленно, сейчас. А не забалтывать это десятилетиями. зачем надо было поддерживать террористов на Северном Кавказе и использовать террористические явно организации для попыток развала Российской Федерации? Но это же делали, и я как бывший директор ФСБ это знаю наверняка. Мы работали там с двойной агентурой, они нам докладывали, какие задачи перед ними ставили западные спецслужбы. Ну зачем это надо было делать? Наоборот, надо было относиться к России как к возможному союзнику, укреплять его. Нет, все наоборот. Попытка дальнейшего развала. Ясно и четко дали понять, что дальнейшее движение НАТО на восток неприемлемо. Но чего здесь непонятного? Мы что ли ставим ракеты рядом с границами Соединенных Штатов? Нет. Это же Соединенные Штаты своими ракетами пришли к нашему дому. На пороге нашего дома находятся уже. Ну разве это какое-то избыточное требование? Не ставить больше никаких ударных систем у нашего дома. Без всяких хитростей. Мы просто прямо поставили вопрос, что никакого движения НАТО на восток дальше быть не должно. Мяч на их стороне, они должны нам что-то ответить. В этой связи хотел бы подчеркнуть, что в целом мы видим пока положительную реакцию. Значит, и американский партнер нам говорит о том, что они готовы к началу этой дискуссии, этих переговоров в самом начале года. Ни одного дюйма на восток, сказали нам на 90-е годы. Ну и чего? Надули. Просто нагло обманули. 5 волн расширения НАТО. Теперь уже, пожалуйста, сейчас в Польше появляются соответствующие системы. Вот о чем речь. Ну поймите же вы в конце концов. Не мы кому-то угрожаем. Мы что ли пришли туда, к границам США? Или к границам Великобритании? Или к нам пришли. И теперь еще говорят, нет, теперь и Украина будет.
People keep parking their cars in the street and blocking the traffic, so the bus occasionally does that. Presses the horn until the person blocking the street with their car appears and moves their car. And there we go. And beep. Interesting. A bit longer than it usually is.
Voisitteko niistä bonuksista vihdoinkin mainita jotain?
Ei nyt kuulu tähän, Seppo.
Let's cross to Moscow and correspondent Jake Cordell. Jake, there are going to be more talks Wednesday in Brussels, Thursday with nations of the OSCE. In this case, is it fair to say, listening to those senior diplomats, that they've broken the ice?
I think that's probably a fair assessment. Yes, breaking the ice. There were no breakthroughs expected today, and that's exactly what occurred. The US didn't even say that these were negotiations. They just said this was both sides putting their positions on the table. And from those statements, we heard they both said it was a business-like professional meeting. The two sides talked for more than 7 hours. So substantive are the issues they need to get into. But the key issue, the key dividing issue still remains. Russia came out of the meeting saying it needs concrete legal guarantees that NATO will never expand and will never admit Ukraine and Georgia specifically as new members in the future. The US immediately, their lead negotiator, hit back on those ideas and said it would never allow any other country to close the door on a different country from joining NATO. So it's clear that there really are substantive issues between the two sides, but there are at least 2 more big meetings to come this week. And the US and Russia both said they would take stock at the end of the week and then discuss what happens next.
And parallel to that, there have been lower level talks that have been going on these issues outside of Ukraine when it comes to nuclear non-proliferation.
Yeah, that's right. That's one area where the two sides have come together recently. We saw a few weeks ago a rare joint statement between the US, Russia, and the other members of the UN Permanent Security Council, which said that a nuclear war should never be fought and it could never be won. And it seems maybe common sense, but the fact that the sides are able to sit down and put that statement out is a sign. The US feels in these negotiations that it can offer something in the way of nuclear non-proliferation. It said today it's ready to discuss the idea of its missile deployments in Europe and the positioning of them. That's another area of concern from Russia, is the US has a lot of missiles and military bases around Russia. That's one of the concerns we hear a lot about here in Moscow. So that's one of the areas of concession. We also saw today the Russian side coming out and saying it was ready. It said that NATO should be willing to meet it halfway in its demands. And that's something we haven't heard before. Even going into the meeting, Russia was saying there was no room for compromise. But still, we have from the US these threats of very harsh, very severe sanctions on Russia if it does step into Ukraine. So while there has been positive talk on issues of non-proliferation, the key issue of Ukraine remains.
And certainly 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border did succeed in grabbing Washington's attention. How strong Moscow's bargaining position is an open question when we'll be putting it to our panel, Jake, later in the France 24 debate, particularly since Russia's got fires in its own backyard, what with the situation, the open revolt we saw the last 5 days in Kazakhstan, which seems to have been quelled. Which is getting more coverage where you are? The talks in Geneva or Kazakhstan?
Over the last week, it's clearly been the issues in Kazakhstan, which were really a surprise because Kazakhstan was seen as probably one of the most stable, if not the most stable, of Russia's neighbors, especially after the revolution and turmoil we've seen in Belarus, which was previously another stable partner of Russia. The other thing to mention is this issue of Ukraine. We're now 8 years after the annexation of Crimea and 8 years after the West has imposed sanctions on Russia. And that really was a very big turning point, both in Russia's foreign policy and domestic policy. So in terms of the coverage and topics we're seeing on Russian state TV, the issue of Ukraine gets mentioned, but the fact that we're 8 years into an ongoing war between Russian-backed separatists and Ukraine in the Donbass means that this issue of Ukraine is never far from the agenda anyway. So it's just been ticking over. These talks are really in Russia and Moscow maybe not seen as anything new or exciting, whereas the developments in Kazakhstan really were a shock. And Russia will be hoping it can quell that issue, or that issue is already being quelled in Kazakhstan, and it can now divert attention back to Ukraine.
Jake Cordell in Moscow, many thanks for that live update.
Of the United States and Russia remain at a standstill this morning after the first day of negotiations this week over Russia's military buildup at the border of Ukraine. The two sides remain at odds over Moscow's demands that Ukraine be barred from joining NATO. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman calling the security guarantee a non-starter. Russia's deputy foreign minister says Putin has no intentions to attack Ukraine and that the West should not fear, quote, any kind of escalation. Joining me right now is Fox News senior strategic analyst, General Jack Keane. General, it's great to see you this morning. Thank you so much for being here. There's a NATO-Russia Council meeting in Brussels tomorrow. Are you expecting any progress? What are your thoughts on what we're hearing from the Russians?
Well, certainly, I think we are where we thought we would be, at an impasse. Obviously, Mr. Putin here has gotten something that he's wanted for the 22 years he's been in power. And that is, he's having discussions with the United States, and as you indicated with the NATO leaders on Wednesday, of reconstructing the European security architecture and moving that in a direction that to his favor. That's what's really on the table here, certainly. The impasse over Ukraine becoming a member of NATO is at the heart of this. You know, when you think about it, Putin's policy, he came into Crimea and eastern Ukraine because the people of Ukraine threw out his stooge, who was running the government, Yanukovych. And as a result of that, Putin believed that that would galvanize the people to move towards Russia, that indeed, because of the historic and cultural ties, that they would turn from moving towards the West, but they would move towards Russia. And the exact opposite has happened, Maria. The Ukrainians are moving away from Russia in terms of what they want. They want economic integration with the West and security integration as well. And that's at the heart of his frustration here. But he may be successful in this. While the United States and NATO will never make a public statement that Ukraine is going to be barred from NATO or NATO is not going to expand any further, that's just not going to be on the table for the United States and NATO. De facto, he may accomplish just that. Because the United States and the European nations, they have no intention of bringing Ukraine into NATO in the near term. That's just a fact. And it may literally be off the table for years to come.
So do you believe the Russians when they say there's no reason to believe that Russia will attack Ukraine?
I believe there's every reason to believe that Russia will invade Ukraine. The evidence is there, 110,000 troops, and he's increasing those troops as we speak. Certainly, if he gets the concessions he thinks he may be able to get because of the weakness of the European leaders and what he believes is the weakness of the Biden administration, then yes, he doesn't have to use those troops. He's using them as a demonstration, as leverage to get those kind of concessions. I think the upcoming meetings with the NATO leaders is really crucial because Germany and France both have been soft on Russia. And he has talked to both of those leaders, Putin that is, last week. And we'll see if their spine is as stiff as it needs to be, along with the United States being on the same page and not folding to these pressures. And that's what Putin wants. He wants to see some division here so he can get some concessions. And I suspect he has already got the Germans and the French moving in his direction somewhat. We'll see. The meeting on Wednesday will be crucial.
Well, of course, with the Nord Stream pipeline and the partnership there in terms of their needs for energy, what do you make of China inserting itself? The Chinese foreign minister has offered Kazakhstan law enforcement, special operations forces as that country deals with the violent anti-government protests, and Russia sent troops to help. Of course, Russia deployed forces to the country as well. China's new offer now could place the troops from Russia and the CCP in Kazakhstan at the same time, General, where they've both been competing for influence. What are your thoughts on the chess game here?
Well, first of all, the Russian troops are there for the same reason that we have issues with Ukraine. The people are resenting the government. It's a Soviet-style government tied to Putin that is not giving them the quality of their life experience that they want. They have no trust and confidence in it. The same thing happened in Ukraine. The same thing happened in Belarus. So that's why the Russian troops are there, to put down the unrest for the people, because he does not want the government overthrown. The fact that China has raised a flag and is willing to intervene is a big deal. They haven't done anything like this in decades. And that is, it shows you how much interest they have in Central Asia, particularly this one particular country, given their Belt and Road Initiative. They have natural resources there, lots of oil, lots of uranium. There's a lot of programs that China has going. And also this, there's over 1,000-mile border of Kazakhstan and Xinjiang province, which is the province that the Uyghurs are in, and where in the China's mind, there's Muslim and Turkic unrest there that needs to be put down. So China sees a security issue here to protect their economic interests as well. And it is a major shift in their foreign policy to offer up those troops.
Also not too far from Afghanistan. Well, what about the fact that China named a top internal security forces officer who helped lead Beijing's crackdown on Xinjiang? They're naming him as the new chief of the army post in Hong Kong, General. Okay, this move coming as Beijing is tightening its control over Hong Kong. We know that they're crushing dissent. Hong Kong's constitution says that the People's Liberation Army forces stationed in the region should not interfere with local affairs. General, come on. They will not stop crushing dissent in Hong Kong, and they're making it clear who's in charge.
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, this is further testimony how serious they are on the crackdown in Hong Kong and taking away the rule of law and democracy. They're promoting someone who's been participating, has got blood on his hands in terms of committing genocide in Xinjiang province against the Uyghurs. I mean, this is an international criminal as far as I'm concerned, and he should be sanctioned for it. But it underscores how strongly China believes about Hong Kong and how they're going to keep the lid on that, and they're not going to put up with protest demonstrations.
So how are you doing, Rick?
Now, I mean, it's going to what's going to take place in Hong Kong is what takes place routinely in mainland China, and that is simply they're going to put down any opposition whatsoever.
Yeah, and it leads me to the question is Taiwan next? Is Tibet next? I mean, there you go. We're seeing exactly who the CCP is. General, a question for another day. We so appreciate your time this morning. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, great talking to Maria.
This is, by the way, almost exactly word for word what I was afraid of was going to happen with NATO back in the early 2000s. You need to do is read the Project for a New American Century, the documents about it, and then you're going to see why the Russians are a little miffed. This thing on the left side keeps popping up even though I keep closing it. Like that. I have no idea why. YouTube is really becoming a piece of shit. A real freaking turd.
Haaveiletko uudesta keittiöstä? Kannattaa lisätä overia haaveiluun.
Thank you for joining us. This is our top story. The Permanent Council of the world's largest security body is meeting in Vienna today. This is the first meeting between the 57 member states of OSCE and third round of talks this week to defuse the situation surrounding Ukraine. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the OSCE, is an important partner for NATO. The allies attach great importance to the role of the OSCE in fostering dialogue, building trust, and upholding the rules-based international order. Thus, this will be a third attempt at striking a dialogue between Washington and Moscow. The last two meetings held this week in Geneva and Brussels failed to yield any breakthrough. The United States has largely settled on the options for sanctions against Russia should it invade Ukraine. The country says it will be prepared to impose sanctions as soon as any tanks roll.
We've already seen a significant effort by Moscow to make false claims about Europe, Ukraine, and the United States in an effort to excuse Russia's behavior and potentially create a pretext for Russia to further invade Ukraine. No one should be surprised if Russia spreads disinformation about commitments that have not been made, or if Moscow goes even further and instigates something as a pretext for further destabilizing activity. As you heard from the deputy this morning, we urge everyone not to fall for Moscow's continuing disinformation.
Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexei Pushko says the talks have been open and direct, but warns of consequences if the ties worsen.
Мы сегодня констатировали, что состоялся очень откровенный разговор, об этом говорил Йенс Столтенберг, он был трудным, глубоким, откровенным, и это уже хорошо с учетом той остроты ситуации, которая сложилась в сфере европейской безопасности. Еще раз подчеркну, мы сделали первый шаг, мы изложили на бумаге, мы опубликовали наше видение, как мы видим движение вперед в правильном направлении, И сегодня мы призвали наших партнеров к тому, чтобы и они тоже...
Потому что. Why do Russians keep saying that? Does it mean the same thing as the Finnish equivalent of you have to remember? There are a couple of words in Russian that are the same in Finnish, like toveri, which to me is all kinds of funny. Потому что. You must remember. What do I must remember? This sounds like paranoid schizophrenia to me. A lot of the stuff that these countries actually do to each other, it seems like paranoid schizophrenia with very little attachment to reality. They're not acting like neighbors who happen to get into a fight. They're acting like people who have prepared to get into a fight their entire life living in the neighborhood. And when it finally breaks out, they're like, oh yeah, man. I doubt anyone has any idea of how bad it would be if Russia and China and their Central Asian allies and Belarus and such really got into a shooting war with the West. I doubt the people who on the West side talk about how easy it would be and Russia's a cakewalk have any idea of what it would actually be like. It just seems like they're misguided. It would be very hard pressed to fight against Russia without US. Uh-huh.
Reissussa muista käyttää kanta-asiakaskorttia.
The US and the Europeans and the NATO members all are trying to show Russia that they stand together on this issue of Ukraine. There's going to be talks between Russia and NATO, and then Russia and the OSCE. And Wendy Sherman is actually going to be in Brussels ahead of that NATO-Russia meeting to speak to NATO members about what was discussed with the Russians, between the Russians and the Americans. So Washington really trying to show that they are keeping the Europeans, that they are keeping NATO members in the loop of what is happening. They've been repeating over and over again, leading up to these talks. Whoever you talk to, whether it's the White House or the State Department, nothing happens about Europe, about Ukraine, without Ukraine, about our allies, without our allies. And they've made a very big point to show that they are keeping their allies in these discussions and that they're going to work together to face Russia.
Catherine Borstani there talking to me earlier on.
With US-Russia relations the most tense they've been since the end of the Cold War. Talks to try and defuse a crisis. America and Russia's deputy chief diplomats, their frosty body language not encouraging, and failing to make progress on the issue of Ukraine joining NATO. Russia's deputy foreign minister has compared this crisis to the Cuban missile standoff, which took the world to the brink of nuclear war. After the talks, he wasn't sounding compromising.
We need ironclad, waterproof, bulletproof, legally binding guarantees, not assurances, not safeguards, guarantees with all the words shall, must, everything that should be put in this bill. Never ever becoming member of NATO.
Can I put to you the words of the Ukraine ambassador this morning on Sky News, who said that many dead Russian bodies will be returned to Moscow if Putin moves against his country? Does that worry you?
It is worrying because it shows how nonsensical many Ukrainian officials are.
Russia is demanding sweeping security guarantees that NATO will never let Ukraine join as a member and will end its activities in countries in Eastern Europe that have already joined. America says that is a non-starter, but is prepared to talk about military exercises and missile deployments, leaving a huge gulf between the two sides. With 100,000 Russian troops on Ukraine's border, there is a lot at stake. Miscalculation or clumsy diplomacy could lead to escalation and conflict.
The buildup that Russia is undertaking right now is leaving them an option to conduct what would be the largest military operation in Europe, maybe since the Second World War.
After 8 hours of discussions, they're still far from any agreement, except to carry on talks when NATO meets Russia on Wednesday, the next chance to reduce tensions and avert conflict. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Geneva.
It's interesting to watch what's happening in space while we're doing this thing on Earth. You think? we on? The
We begin
Indian
today in
news.
Brussels, scene of a crucial meeting between NATO and Russia, the NATO-Russia Council, and in Brussels right now, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is speaking. Let's listen to his remarks.
Space and cyber threats. Allies have also offered to look at arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation, including to address reciprocal limitations on missiles and to address nuclear policies. On lines of communications, NATO allies are interested in looking at ways to improve civil and military communication channels and the possibility of re-establishing our respective offices in Moscow and in Brussels. NATO allies are clear-eyed about the prospects for progress in these talks. They expressed serious concern about the Russian military build-up in and around Ukraine and called on Russia to immediately de-escalate the situation and to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbors. They also called on Russia to refrain from aggressive force posturing and malign activities directed against allies and abide by all its international obligations and commitments.
Sure. When are you going to pull out of Iraq?
Means that our dialogue, all this means that our dialogue is difficult, but even more necessary. NATO allies stress that they will make every effort to find a political way forward. I also welcome the bilateral consultations between the United States and Russia and tomorrow's meeting of the OSCE. These are opportunities for constructive engagement which should not be missed in the interest of security in Europe. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, we'll go to CNN in the third row center.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. I'm Alex Marquardt from CNN. These talks did go a little bit longer today. Could you tell us what specific issues prolonged these talks? And NATO allies have repeatedly rejected Russia's demand that Ukraine never join NATO, but do you acknowledge that there are divisions among the allies over Ukraine's accession to NATO, and that Ukraine likely will not join NATO anytime soon?
We had a frank and open discussion on a wide range of issues, of course, focusing on the tensions, the difficulties in and around Ukraine, and allies also, of course, again expressed a deep concern about the continued Russian military build-up along the borders of Ukraine. And combined with threatening rhetoric from the Russian side and a Russian track record of willingness to use force against neighbors, of course, allies are concerned. And we are clear-eyed about the challenges we face when we now sit down with Russia and try to find a political way forward. But the meeting was useful, and I think that especially when tensions are high, it is even more important that we meet and that all allies and Russia meet and sit around the same table and address the issues that are of concern. On membership and on NATO's open door, all allies are united on the core principle that each and every nation has the right to choose its own path. This is enshrined in a lot of fundamental documents, many different documents, which are the foundation for European security. And therefore also allies totally agree that it is only Ukraine and 30 allies that can decide when Ukraine is ready to become a NATO member. No one else has anything to say, and of course Russia doesn't have a veto on whether Ukraine can become a NATO member. Allies are ready to support Ukraine on its path towards membership, helping to implement reforms, modernize the armed forces to meet NATO standards, and then at the end of the day, it has to be NATO allies and Ukraine that decides on membership.
We'll go to TASS in the second row.
Thank you very much, Denis Dubrovin, TASS News Agency. Mr. Secretary General, it seems you have at least slight progress on the issue of risk reduction. Do you consider that after these talks, it may be feasible in the future to move towards new treaty limiting the use of missiles in Europe, offensive missile system? Yeah.
The NATO allies made it clear in the meeting that we are ready to schedule a series of meetings addressing a wide range of different topics, including missiles and reciprocal verifiable limits on missiles in Europe. From the Russian side, they made it clear that they are not ready. They were not ready today to agree on such a schedule of meetings. I think you should ask them to explore or to explain their position more in detail. But at least I welcome that there is a general willingness and support of the idea of dialogue. And NATO allies have also made it clear that we are ready to put concrete proposals on the table and to discuss risk reduction, transparency, but also arms control, including reciprocal, verifiable limits on missiles. But let me add that we are in this situation because Russia violated the INF Treaty. We had the ban, we had the treaty banning all intermediate range weapons, dual capable, conventional and nuclear. And it was really a cornerstone of arms control. And then Russia started to deploy missiles in Europe in violation of that treaty. So the reason why we are where we are is that the treaty that banned missiles, all intermediate range missiles, conventional and nuclear, that treaty has collapsed. We have seen the demise because of extensive Russian violations, deployments of missiles in violation of the treaty. So we are ready to sit down. We support arms control. I know it's possible to reach agreements, but then, of course, we need verifiable and balanced limitations, both on conventional and on nuclear forces.
To the national.
Go for the Russian view. What do they say?
Iso alue. Tästä tulee reilu alennus. Tämä halu.
Good evening. This is the news on RT America. I'm your host, Farron Franzak, bringing you the headlines from the RT America studios right here in our nation's capital. Here's the headlines we're digging deeper for you on. First up, worlds collide in Geneva as officials from both the United States and Russia come together. This is Ukraine, and the situation in Kazakhstan remain a hot-button issue. We've got the latest on that. Plus, crime is up across the country, but that's not old news, folks. But there is one major U.S. city rehauling their police efforts in 2022, which are great to some, controversial to others. We're going to discuss it all with the panel. And finally, want to know the history of outer space? Up until now, your guess was as good as any scientist, but a new telescope is giving us a glimpse into the outer space backstory. We're going to explain. Well, let's get after it, so come with us and question more.
road, but by most indicators, Russia and the U.S. seem committed to improving relations. High-level officials from the two superpowers met in Geneva today, and although some say that there are a number of hurdles which must be crossed, hope still does remain. Here to pick up the story is Alex Mihailovich.
A quick photo or two, and then right down to business. After an informal dinner last night, senior U.S. and Russian officials met in Geneva today as a part of a list of diplomatic meetings in Europe this week, which address Russian security concerns, as well as a military buildup on both sides of the Russia-Ukraine border. The face-to-face talks took place between Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov and U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, along with their respective teams. Following the meeting, Sherman told reporters that so far, the talks have been frank and forthright.
The United States came to today's extraordinary meeting prepared to hear Russia's security concerns and to share our own. We came as well with a number of ideas where our two countries could take reciprocal action that would be in our security interests and improve strategic stability.
Among the ideas that the American delegation raised today, to hopefully be further discussed, are the West's missile placements in Europe, limiting military exercises and improving transparency about those exercises on both the West's and Russia's side, and nuclear arms control. However, Sherman stated that the U.S. was not willing to put a halt to NATO's eastward expansion along Russia's borders, saying that NATO's open door policy for new members has always been central to the alliance. For Russia, this subject is not negotiable.
If now NATO proceeds towards deployment of capabilities that are being developed very rapidly in the US and will possibly be introduced somewhere in Europe, it would require a military response on the Russian part. That is a decision to counter this threat through means at our discretion that will inevitably, unavoidably damage security of the US and its European allies.
On the subject of Ukraine, the disconnect between the two superpowers also continued. To the US, one of the main points of the meetings with Russian officials was to defuse the tense situation at the Russia-Ukraine border, where reports say Russia has an estimated 100,000 troops stationed, raising concerns about a possible invasion of Ukraine. Echoing Moscow's past statements, Russia's deputy foreign minister said that there is nothing to be worried about.
We explained to our colleagues that in no way do we plan or intend to, quote-unquote, attack Ukraine, and all the arrangements regarding the combat readiness of the armed forces are made within our national territory. Thus, there's no reason to fear an escalation scenario in that respect.
Ryabkov said that he felt U.S. diplomats took the Russian suggestions very seriously at today's meeting. The Geneva talks will be followed by a NATO-Russia meeting in Brussels on Wednesday and a meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Vienna on Thursday. For News on RT America, I'm Alex Mihailovich.
And to discuss all of this earlier, we were joined by professor and historian Peter Kuznick. Take a listen.
There are a lot of threats being hurled back and forth by both sides. But the fact that they met today, that they met for more than 7 hours, that it was a serious and substantive discussion, that there are going to be meetings on Wednesday and Thursday, the Russian NATO Council, the OSCE, this is all very positive. It doesn't mean that they're going to agree on things. Putin has issued his red lines. He has issued his demands. The United States has already said there are certain demands that Russia wants that the United States cannot possibly meet. However, there are other things that we can agree on, and let's start making progress on those. But there are also ways to give private assurances, even though they're not going to be in writing, they're not going to be stated publicly, that will ease the tensions. And that, I think, is the best case scenario right now.
Freaking moron doing private assurances when they're saying that we only give private assurances and then we back out of those like we did with the Indians is moronic. And private assurances at this time would be private for 1 minute until they're made public, and then look, that is as if the Molotov-Ribbentrop. Can't even watch this. I gotta smoke that weed. 22 tons. Holy shit, my apartment would collapse under that weight. It'd be so nice. 22 fucking tons. Can you imagine that? Holy shit. I think we're about the end of this news cycle. I might put up a little bit of conversation with Noise Map at the end, but it's feeling like it may not be anything left to say. I will stand by my original point. Both sides seem absolutely insane, which is what a man seems like when he is forced to defend himself against somebody who he thinks is kind of friendly, but still not friendly.
Sonic, ota homma haltuun.
All right, so let's start with the big story that we are tracking on Beyond Disarm. That after 4 long hours of negotiations between Russia and the NATO members, there is still no breakthrough on the issue of Ukraine. The United States has not.
Have you noticed that a lot of these news things refer to the NATO as alliance membership, yada yada, and they always refer to Russia by either a singular form, not Russia and its allies. And when they refer to the Russian president, they don't say President Putin. They very often say just Putin, which is a form of psychological warfare where they are trying to make their own side appear bigger and the opposite seem to be alone.
On the options for sanctions against Russia should they decide to carry out a ground invasion of Ukraine. He said that it will be prepared to impose sanctions any time.
We've already seen a significant effort by Moscow to make false claims about Europe, Ukraine, and the United States in an effort to excuse Russia's behavior and potentially create a pretext for Russia to further invade Ukraine. No one should be surprised if Russia spreads disinformation about commitments that have not been made, or if Moscow goes even further and instigates something as a pretext for further destabilizing activity. As you heard from the deputy this morning, we urge everyone not to fall for Moscow's.
Keep in mind, a couple of years ago when we said that the US is instigating things like the Gulf of Tonkin incident to get the right to invade, in this case, Vietnam, or doing other things where they're instigating somebody else to get them into a war. And anytime that happens, they're like, this is completely normal. And when somebody else is supposedly doing the same, they're like, keep in mind, this is no longer a conspiracy theory, which you will get medication for because it's us saying it's Russia. But go back like 5 years and tell to a psychiatrist that you're worried NATO's going to invade you because they've been invading a lot of weird countries lately, and they'll medically sedate you.
The Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko has said that talks with NATO in Brussels have been open and direct. The United States has also warned that a further worsening of ties will actually bring unpredictable consequences for European security.
Мы сегодня констатировали, что состоялся очень откровенный разговор, об этом говорил Йенс Столтенберг, он был трудным, глубоким, откровенным, и это уже хорошо с учетом той остроты ситуации, которая сложилась в сфере европейской безопасности. Еще раз подчеркну, мы сделали первый шаг, мы изложили на бумаге, мы опубликовали наше видение, как мы видим движение вперед в правильном направлении. И сегодня мы призвали наших партнеров к тому, чтобы и они тоже изложили на бумаге о своих представлениях, в каком направлении двигаться. И тогда станет понятно, какие инструменты, в том числе переговорные форматы, могут быть востребованы для того, чтобы обеспечить.
But also NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said that Russia will not dictate the security arrangements in other nations.
NATO allies are clear-eyed about the prospects for progress in these talks. They expressed serious concern about the Russian military build-up in and around Ukraine and called on Russia to immediately de-escalate the situation and to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbors.
Like you did
they
with
also
the
called on
Cubans,
Russia to refrain from aggressive force
Iraqis,
posturing
or the
and
Vietnamese,
align
or the
activities
Afghanis.
directed against allies and abide by all its international obligations and commitments. And this means that our dialogue, all this means that our dialogue is difficult, but even more necessary. NATO allies stress that they will make every effort to find a political way forward.
While Russia has denied on multiple occasions that it has no plans of invading into Ukraine, Washington and its allies have said that they simply cannot trust Moscow by its whistle. Now, Moscow has put forth some pretty strong demands from the 30-member bloc. Firstly, to end any further NATO expansion in Eastern Europe, and secondly, to withdraw the forces of the NATO alliance from the Central and Eastern European nations to the boundaries that existed way back in 2008. And thirdly, that no former Soviet nations should be included in this military alliance. And all NATO members have refused to bow down to Russia's demands. In fact, in the latest meeting, the bloc has said that it is the member decision to decide as to who should be a part of the alliance. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.
Yes, I'm invading the Ukrainian. Might actually be possible. If so, we can theoretically find the center point singularity of this universe. And I believe it might, in our view, be in the past, but it should, in theory, be visible in the night sky if we look just right. There should be a bright center point, and it should become apparently visible after the inflationary period of the universe ends. If it ever ends, that's the last moment it should be visible, or it should be visible at minimum at that moment. And once again, the left side thing pops up. God, this service is becoming such shite. God, this service is such shite. keyboard from the phone fell out, so it was almost out of battery.
Next verse you shoot. Right about a minute. 5, 4, 3. Alright, 5, 4, 3, 2. 5, 4, 3.
You're low, bring it up.
See the splash. It looks like it's online. I just can't. I'm not catching vapor at all.
Technically speaking, we don't shoot this far with having this.
Roger.
The 90 meters, 700 meters, it tells you what dope to use. So
Not write down data right now because it's random paper. That's what I got for us. Okay. With starting with left.
2, let everyone go. You gotta turn around, face the team route, we say fire the hole. Push. Halt. Halted, boy.
The thing is that as long as roughly both sides talk of civilians as their sides civilians and our sides civilians, then I don't have much hope for this being solved well. Once the language turns from the defensive alliance NATO and Mr. Putin to the military alliance NATO and Russia's President Putin, and the talk of civilians as their civilians or our civilians turns to just civilians, we might see some breakthrough here. But the thing isn't going well because, roughly speaking, the actions of Trump you could predict. He is a businessman. He's interested in making money for the US. But an old aristocratic leader who sees world domination as a business of honor, where if you are the larger party and the other person doesn't do what you ask, your job is to beat them with a stick until they do what you ask. The traditional parent style role versus somebody who is not the traditional parent style role is going to be not a good one. And Biden and the current US administration, President Biden and the current US administration, strongly reminds me of the parent who sees no problem beating their child to an inch of their life because they said something off about them. And when that style of government runs into the petulant opposition child who also has nuclear weapons, they believe, perhaps strongly and wrongly in the West, that such nuclear weapons will be used in a way where they still retain the victory, because after all, the child couldn't beat up the parent. And that is what I'm seeing here. I'm seeing Russia and the East get a position of being the single mother, the weird kid, the emo kid, and so on. Even North Korea is clearly the emo kid running. And the West is playing the role of the good parent and saying we have to do this and we have to do that. And the Eastern countries are like, you've given us nothing but shit for 20 years and you expect us to follow you. It's like seeing a parent who has abused their child for the child's entire life, and the parent realizes that they're about to not be good in relation to others in their view, and they go like, we must get the family unified for this, and it's not a good thing. I'm quite afraid that despite President Putin being a little nuts, to put it politely, I'm worried that President Biden is the stereotypical parent raising the rest of the planet as a kid, and they're running into Russia and thinking it's the criminal lord that keeps corrupting the children, and it's a cause of true justice to defeat them, and it's like a holy crusade because they're corrupting the children, they're spreading misinformation and causing these easy to be misbelieved youth attacking our parliament, and they are behind this youth being angry at us. After all, if there were no opposition to a line behind, the youth would only be friendly to us. So if we remove the opposition, we will remove the people being unfriendly to us, and that's what I'm afraid of that they're doing. They are seeing the fact that some people actually in the West support Russia as something that must be taken like a true insult or wrong action. And they're not seeing it in terms of sometimes people support you and sometimes they oppose you. They're seeing it in terms of a parent and a child with, say, a drug problem, for example. That's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a lot of echoes of the old guy acting like they have to act appropriately, and their act of appropriateness is from 50 years ago. So it's going to be the N-word police. But yeah, I think it seems likely to me that the conversation will win out, but I wouldn't be surprised if this goes bad. It's the US under the rule of the authoritarian parent who thinks that anybody who has the support of the children besides him is naturally bad because they are corrupting the children. It's what I'm seeing in the US conversation. So here's to hoping that this thing won't explode, but I will say that it looks like it might.